Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to have you here to discuss with us civic education in China. Today, I'm the panel manager. I'm Yiran Zhao from Harvard Graduate School of Education, and we have three speakers. Let me briefly introduce them. Professor Fernando Reimers here is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Education and also the Director of International Education Policy Program at Harvard Graduate School of Education, which is also my program. Professor Reimers' research focuses on educational innovation, global education, and on the impact of policy, leadership, curriculum, and professional development on the quality and relevancy of education to develop 21st century skills and expand opportunity for socially disadvantaged children and youth. He has designed and led a number of innovative education programs and curricula, and recently led the design of the World Course, a global studies curriculum for the Avenue School. Professor Helen Haste is a visiting professor at Graduate School of Education here at Harvard. She's also an emeritus professor of psychology at the University of Bath, UK. She has been working for 40 years on moral and political development and action through empirical and theoretical work on peace movements, gender politics, and political engagement of young people. Her work on unconventional civic action, alongside her work on moral commitment, defines civic participation more broadly, with civic engagements arising from a wide range of experiences and preconditions. Her current research project is exploring how young people in China understand civic and social moral issues and the extent to which they feel able and motivated to engage in civic activity, and she will talk about this project today. Professor Honglei Li, I'm sure many of you remember him from yesterday's panel, and he's going to speak most. Professor Honglei Li is a professor at the philosophy department of Sun Yat-sen University in China. In 2010, he renovated the Shide School, a traditional school originally built in Ming and Qing dynasties. He founded and presided over the Hainan Province Youngsters Traditional Culture Education Base, there to foster modern independent personality and willingness to serve the society. Over the years, Professor Honglei Li has devoted himself to integrate the Eastern and Western cultures to develop healthy human mind and a reasonable order of modern society in order to promote sustainable development and the prosperity of the world civilization. And he will talk about his work there today. Now, let's invite Professor Reimers first to answer the question, how global is Chinese citizenship?
Thank you very much, Iran, for the introduction. And thank you all very much for your participation at this conference. I am delighted to see how attendance to this conference has grown in the few years since this student initiative developed. I'm going to mostly raise some questions for our panel. And to set the stage for that, I'm going to state that civic education, as I understand it, is a product of the Enlightenment. As you know, the Enlightenment was a broad philosophical movement of the 16th and 17th century that included philosophers that had slightly, there was competition of ideas as well as consensus, but the basic consensus of that project was that we should replace the aspiration of salvation with the aspiration of the reduction in human suffering, and reduction in self-improvement. And reduction in human suffering would come about as a result of the work of people, individually and with others, to participate in what Habermas called the public sphere. Another tenet of the Enlightenment was the aspiration then to replace superstition and the abuses of church and state for reason supported by science, and so on. So the American Revolution was very much inspired by the Enlightenment, this notion that ordinary individuals would be able to rule themselves, that there was not to be a class of superior people destined to rule and other people destined to serve, but that in fact common people would be able to build the institutions that allowed them to govern themselves and to produce social progress is very much an Enlightenment idea central to the American democratic experiment, to the American social project. An example of how important that idea is, and now central to this idea that ordinary people can join together in building the commons, is the notion that one needs to be tolerant of those who are different. among various dimensions. Station in life being one of them, religion being another one, race and ethnicity. So if you look at the history of the American civic project, it's a history of constantly expanding this definition of equality to include more and more people. Early on in the American project, George Washington, a couple of years after the US Constitution had been approved, made a visit along with Thomas Jefferson and with the governor of Newport of Rhode Island to Rhode Island, which was one of the last states to ratify the Constitution. And in this visit, he gave a very important speech that underscores the importance of tolerance to the American experiment. It was a speech to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, where he basically says, you should be free to practice your religion and understand that you will have full rights and benefits of participation in this experiment. That letter of General Washington, of first President Washington, to the Hebrew congregation of New York is considered a very important document that states that in this experiment, the freedom to have different religions and to expect that one will be accepted given that difference is part and parcel of what this experiment is. So in that light, I'm going to share evidence based on data collected by the World Values Survey on how China today compares with all the other countries which participate in the World Values Survey. World Values Survey is a random survey of political attitudes and beliefs and knowledge which has been collected over 6 decades, every so many years in different countries. Based at the University of Michigan, data are available for anyone who wants to analyze it. And I think that the evidence that I will see suggests to me that there are important problematic challenges as China hopes to build itself into a nation of citizens that can collaborate in building the common, but more importantly, as citizens who want to engage in the global commons. One of the consequences of globalization is the possibility that because we all have to interact much more frequently and intensely with people from different civilizational perspectives, it is important to have competencies to engage in these global commons, whether it's the global commons of trade, whether it's the global commons of the institutions that were created largely after World War II to ensure governance and stability. And I would argue that the basic idea of toleration, of tolerance and acceptance of difference, which is so central to the democratic aspiration that ordinary people can be in charge of social progress, is even more necessary for participation in global institutions. And so let me show some of these evidence. On the surface, when Chinese people are asked, how much do you trust others? There are very good news because there are very high levels of trust that people report in these surveys in China relative to other countries. So the question is, can you trust other people? And the options of response go all the way from most people can be trusted, that's one option, to you can't really be too careful in trusting other people, kind of the opposite. Now, China's level of trust are very high relative to the rest of the world. It doesn't mean that everybody is trusting. It's only 50% of the population who expresses that most people can be trusted. But compare that with the United States, where only 40% of the population believe that most people can be trusted. It's high. China is right up there with Switzerland, not very far from Finland, New Zealand, Australia, and so on. Great news, right? But when people are asked, not can others be trusted in general, but when people are asked, what are important values that we should cultivate in children? And they're given a number of options. So this question, tolerance and respect for others, which is absolutely indispensable in modern democracies, right? And where in the United States, 80% of the people believe that this is an important value that ought to be cultivated. And in a country like Sweden, 90% of the population expects that we should cultivate tolerant youth. China is really at the other end of this distribution with a little under 70%. So not terrible news, it's not at the bottom, but it's certainly not in the lead as it was with general trust. And I wonder why. In my mind, there is a bit of a paradox that people could at the same time hold the aspiration, the belief that most people can be trusted, while also not holding the desire that one should cultivate tolerance and respect for others, which I think is absolutely intertwined, is part of the same genome, is part of the same ADN of the capacity to join efforts with others in improving the commons. Furthermore, when people are asked, can you trust others who have a different religious faith to the one that you hold? And the options range from trust completely, trust a little, not much, not at all. So I've only computed the two positive ends of the scale. You would see that George Washington would indeed be very happy to see that after a little over 2 centuries, we have succeeded in producing a notion along the lines that he outlined in his letter to the Hebrew congregation in New York, because the majority of the American population, 80%, would trust people of another religion. Now, it's even higher in a country like Sweden and some of these other countries. And of course, I believe that we should be concerned with the 20% of the population who would not trust someone of a different religion. I would say that this shows that the American democratic experiment is incomplete. It's a work in progress. We should worry about these groups, particularly as some of them may become organized and very militant, right? And we see them taking part in the political space. But I am even more concerned about these levels in China, which are the lower levels of trust in people of a different religion in the world. And so I am extremely puzzled by this paradox that on the one hand, China, when people are asked, would you trust others, is at a very high level. When you ask them, should we cultivate tolerance and respect for others, move down to the middle of the distribution. And when people are asked, would you trust others of a different religion, goes all the way to the bottom of the levels of trust in the world. Now you might say, well, religion is not a very different issue in China, although I think that's a question that I would ask to some of you, because I would imagine that if I had a religious faith and practiced that, I would think twice about whether I would want to make that faith visible in China. If I told you here that I have a particular religious faith and that's part of my identity, I would have to assume that if I proceeded to make a statement in my presentation that said, trust me, there would be 90% of you who might be less inclined to trust me than if you didn't know that about myself. Now, it's not just religion. When people are asked, would you trust others who are different in another dimension of identity, nationality? Again, in the United States, this is a work in progress. Our levels of trust for people of a different nationality are slightly lower than our levels of trust for people of a different religion, but by and large, the majority of the population, 3 in 4 persons, would trust a person of a different nationality. It's even higher in countries like Sweden or Norway. Again, China is at the bottom of this distribution. And so I am puzzled about how is it that Chinese respondents to this survey make sense of the world, that they can compartmentalize and on the one hand say, I trust most people. I'm not so sure that developing tolerance and understanding is an important priority, but I really wouldn't trust very much someone of a different nationality or religion. Now you might say, well, for most people, the opportunity to interact with a person of a different religion or nationality in China is not a daily occurrence, although I would submit that as China hopes to continue integrating into the global economy, these should be a very important priority because you should expect to come into contact with people who are different in those dimensions. And the question would be, are even graduates of universities equipped to function in the same way as students in these institutions are? to function in environments that are diverse along religious dimensions or nationality dimensions. But this is particularly worrisome. This is a dimension where we look at a form of difference that is not extreme at all. It involves half of the population. I'm going to show you data for 3 questions that assess trust in women, in the fundamental equality between women and men, the fundamental equality in rights and competencies of women and men. So when people were asked, the scale is reversed here, it's flipped. When people were asked the question, do you agree with the statement that men make better executives than women? So basically it's a statement to measure bigotry. How bigoted are you? How much of a chauvinist are you? And so I quoted those who agree strongly or agree with the statement. So Sweden is almost close. You would expect that perfect equality would be 0. No one would agree with the statement. You wouldn't agree with that. So Sweden is pretty close to that. Canada is pretty good. Andorra, Switzerland. The US, we still have some work to do. 15% of the population self-identifies as bigoted, but it's a good work in progress. But China, again, moves to the opposite end of the extreme. You have 35% of the population who believes that men make better executives than women. Another form of that question is, do men make better political leaders than women? Now, we have a greater problem in the US with this question than we have for jobs, because we have almost 1 in 4 Americans who are bigoted. But China has a much bigger problem in that almost half of the population agrees with that statement. Lastly, another variation of that, which really measures opportunity to be educated. When people were asked the question, is a university of education more important for men than for women? Now, you would expect, again, that at this time, most people say, well, both can benefit from these, both have the same access. We're pretty close to that in the US. It's almost, although we still have 10%, but look at China. You have 20% of the population that agrees with that. So the questions in my mind are these facts, do they present a challenge for China's ability to engage with the project of the Enlightenment, to create a situation where all people are equipped to join efforts in improving the commons? Or does China have a different project? Is the aspiration that is not a project of the Enlightenment, that is the aspiration that civic participation and renewal does not presume or require the assumption that people are fundamentally equal and the fundamental toleration on which the American experiment was based, as reflected in Washington's letter? Now, if the answer to the first question is that indeed these figures are somewhat problematic, reflect the problematic reality, then the question is, what do we do about it? Should tolerance be taught? And if so, how? So these are my questions for our discussion, and I would now like to turn it over to my colleague, Helen Hayes, who's going to take a deeper look at youth and how youth think about engagement. Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure to be here with people who have such a very diverse appreciation of the different cultural bases on which we build our education. I'd like to say thank you again to those who've organized the event, and also thank you to Fernando Ramos, because his talk very much leads into the issues that I want to address in more micro terms. I'm going to talk about a project that I've been involved with for the last couple of years with my colleague Bob Selman and our research officer, Zhuzha. And this has been, for me, an eye-opening experience, because I had very little experience of China before we did this project. And I have learned a huge amount about what actually a very different culture. And I've learned about a very different culture. I've also learned about the assumptions that I brought to my work, assumptions I did not know I had. I did not realize how little I really understood how things work differently from cultures other than Britain, where of course I come from, and even to an extent the United States. So it's been an important learning experience, and I want to share with you some of that fascination that I experienced in this project. The project has been going on now for about 2.5 years, and the people involved, I'll come to it shortly. The goals of the project. We were fascinated by the fact that there's so much change happening in China. So much is going on, quite fundamentally, which is very much affecting young people, and particularly the educational context in which they are growing up. And so our research questions were, how has China's shift to an individualistic ethic reflected in young people's civic and moral values? How do they explain social order and moral and civic responsibility and what it means to be a civic agent? So if you like, that's an understanding, a cognitive dimension. And what can these data tell us about cultural processes? And the team involved, we have a partner in East China Normal University, Professor Zhang Gao, who has been extremely helpful to us in giving us access to schools and the environment generally in Shanghai and Nantong, the two places we collected the data. Okay, so what are the questions then, directly actually we asked? How do they understand civic responsibility? How do they understand moral responsibility? In what civic actions do they engage? And how do they also manage morally charged relational dilemmas? So we bring in as well an affective dimension as well as a cognitive one. So, the research questions we looked at: what constitutes good citizenship and civic and moral responsibility? What social issues concern them? How do they perceive their ability to fulfill these civic responsibilities? And how should dilemmas about teasing and bullying be addressed? We were trying to cover a whole range, if you like, the value worlds of these young people who were in 8th and 11th grade in schools in Shanghai and Nantong. This is the actual sample size. We have mixtures, you see, of questionnaires, interviews, and focus groups, and we also conducted some teacher interviews, which I shan't be talking about today. Okay, so let's ask the question first of all, how important is each of the following in being a good citizen? This is a question that in fact has been used in many studies internationally, so we have actually a lot of good international data from many, many countries. So we know it's a good question which works in many places. It works slightly differently, of course, in China. And we selected the items that we thought were appropriate for the Chinese context. These are questionnaire items, so we have data in the form of scales. And it's quite interesting, we see the scales are in fact a 4-point scale, but what's interesting is the ranking. You see that the most important aspect of being a good citizen is obeying the law. This, in fact, was the case in most countries, as a matter of fact. Obeying the law is seen when you give a questionnaire about good citizenship. Obeying the law comes out top. If you actually ask people as an open-ended question, it doesn't come out anywhere at all. But in questionnaires, it does come out very high. But what's also interesting is what comes next in the list and what comes at the bottom. We see that protecting the environment is very important to these young people. Knowing the country's history is very important to these young people. Following political issues in the media is very important to these young people. Supporting government policies is very important. This is not what is found in other countries. Activities benefit the community, about sort of in the middle of the scale, again, generally regarded as important in most countries. At the very bottom, joining the Communist Party. Now, this is not so surprising because in all nations, joining political parties actually comes bottom of the list. It's not just a Chinese phenomenon, but I think the issue of supporting government policies has come up rather higher in the Chinese data than it has in other countries, which I think, in fact, is quite close to the issues that Fernando is raising. And again, promoting human rights is quite low compared to what it is in other countries where this questionnaire has been used. The second question we asked, next question I want to ask was, what kind of issues would you like to influence government policy on if you had the opportunity? This is a way of getting at what worries them, what concerns them, what are their priorities. As you see, on this list, food safety comes out top. There have been, of course, a number of issues around food safety, very widely reported in the news. And this is something that particularly concerned them. It also came out in the interviews. The entrance exam policy, the extraordinary pressures they're under to do well in the Gaokao is something that concerns them very much. Pollution concerns them very much. Facilities for young people also concern them. But look at the bottom. They're not too worried about the one-child policy. They themselves, of course, are all products of the one-child policy. Nuclear energy doesn't worry them. Discrimination against rural migrant workers doesn't worry them as much as the other issues. So you see the kind of range of things that they're concerned about. They're particularly concerned about food safety and pollution, as well as the pressures they're under with the examination. What have they done? Well, they were surprisingly active. And again, this is quite similar to other countries in which I've done this research. Young people do quite a lot of things. They don't do very much which is called conventionally politics. They do get involved in issues, particularly in the community. These young people have recycled. They've put themselves forward for election in school. They've picked up litter in the park. They've contributed, over half of them have contributed to a blog to express their views. They've raised money, they've helped people in need, and only 3%, in fact, have done nothing at all. So obviously, there's a wide variety of civic-related activities, which are not necessarily conventionally political, but they're certainly civic. These young people are aware of their civic responsibilities. Now, in the interviews, of course, it was more open-ended, so in a way, that's richer data, because we didn't, as it were, prescribe what they should be talking about. We left it open to them to tell us what concerned them. And again, we see pollution in the environment coming up very strongly. Corruption amongst public officials is a major concern for them. Again, the examination policy comes up. And they did raise the question of urban and rural differences. There's quite a lot of difference in the opportunities available to urban and rural young people, as you know. Traffic problems. Having been driven, I did not drive. Having been driven in China, I could sympathize with the concerns about traffic problems. And particularly also materialism and profit-seeking. The moral issues around that did concern them. They were worried about that. We identified in the interviews 3 kinds of response, which really were how can one deal with the social problems that they identified. We were trying to get them to tell us what they felt they could do, to what extent did they feel they were civic agents. Could they do anything? Should they do anything? And if they shouldn't, who should or who could? And to summarize it, because a bit more subtleness, we really found there were 3 kinds of response. Again, coming out of the interview material. We found first what we call the compliant response. The compliant response is that they respond in ways which reflect obedience to the norms and the rules of as they perceive them, which would also include, if they make their voice heard, it will be in accepted ways, not ways that rock the boat. So speaking out is good, but in a way which is conventional, if you like, and acceptable. And this tended to be what we found in the younger kids and also in the rural kids. Cynical. Cynically, these young people believe that nothing can be done. Why? Because the system's corrupt. And there's no point in young people doing anything because the system's corrupt, as well as the fact that, of course, they're young people who haven't got much power. But this is a particular characteristic we found of more urban and older kids tend to talk in these terms. The third category is critical, which is recognizing limitations of what they can do. In other words, they're not over-optimistic about what you actually can do at the age of 17, but they believe that in principle it's important to change the system and improve things, and therefore also to criticize the system appropriately. This is a picture we showed them. This is I cannot read the Chinese, but I'm sure you can. A young teenager called Chen Yihua, who was protesting about the refurbishment of the subway system in Guangzhou, where he lives. He stood outside the subway system holding this banner and asked for people to sign petitions. He was about 17 years old. This is a true story. So we thought this was, to us, quite a surprising event. We thought it would also be an excellent thing to see how our young people responded to an issue concerning protest. So here's some material from 8th graders in a Shanghai school. And I won't read all of it out, but let's focus on some of the things. He did it in the wrong way. There's no good way of doing it, says AF. I cannot think of it in my age. So AF feels impotent, doesn't feel he can do anything, but also he thought that Chen behaved inappropriately. If we move down to what Y8 at the bottom says, he's a good citizen and not a good citizen at the same time. What he did will harm the image of the city. But it's good that he thinks for the interests of the people. No, this young man is thinking in terms of his responsibilities and everyone's responsibilities to preserve the good image of the city, which struck us from our Western eyes as an unusual perspective. Would you do the same thing that Chen did? I wouldn't do, he says, AF. Chen would face a lot of pressure. When he goes out every day, so many people will recognize him. It's not good. So there are social consequences of participating in a protest. Whereas YH said, yes, I would try and persuade others, not necessarily for protest. How can people voice their opinions? Here we get the appropriate ways to voice their opinions. Here we have AF, who is very much compliant, write microblogs on the internet and write letters. But AF feels he hasn't got the ability and he won't count. But KY says it's useful to say something because if you don't, nobody will say it. And the cumulative effect could be quite effective. I spoke to the 11th grade, the older kids. Is Chen Yuihao a hero or a fool? A person of independent thinking? A person of ideas? 300 people is not a large number, but you cannot ignore this number. And again, SY focus go back to, is it good for the community? Are people actually supporting this? M thinks we should actually involve the government, let the government find out what people think, use the appropriate paths for change. And then moving to a bit more, TY thinks the subway company might take revenge, to which SW responds, well, anyone looks impulsive to the eyes of the older generation. We can do nothing if we are afraid all the time. We should be brave and try. But M says in the end, if everybody is like him, there won't be any social order. So we're seeing a tension here between the courage and bravery of Chen Yuihao. Okay, I'll go fairly quickly through the four relational dilemmas. The dilemmas were concerned really bullying of young people who were in some way different. One particular dilemma we used was about a kid who came to school with ratty shoes because of his family were poor. What do you do about it? Now, I'm not going to take you through the quotations. We haven't got time. I will summarize them. We have American data on this. We find that when a child is being bullied in America, what happens is you act in a friendly way towards him or her, and you try and alleviate the situation by providing the resources they need to get, in this case, better shoes. So you overtly help, you raise money for him. And you would also probably try to criticize the people who were teasing. What we found with the Chinese data was really very different, and I will find the appropriate slide because its quotations are particularly interesting. He doesn't need to be helped, he needs to do it himself. Otherwise, he will have a sense of inferiority because he needs help from others. He must gain more self-confidence and less feeling of inferiority. So our responsibility is to give him that self-esteem so he can solve the problem, but not to make him feel that he is inferior or different or in some way excluded. So again, sympathy will offend a person who thinks he's being pitied. If we treat it as something very serious, we are putting him in a special position. It's another way of excluding him. So there are two very different ways of looking at this. One is to say, let's all go out and help the kids, buy him some new shoes, make him feel better, and stop the bulliers from teasing him. In the Chinese context, what comes out is the primary concern to preserve the self-esteem and confidence of the young person concerned, not make him feel or her feel excluded, and also to preserve and maintain social harmony in the classroom. So I leave you with this data, and we will consider perhaps in discussion the kind of conclusions we might draw about the implications for education. But I think what we're showing here is quite profound cultural differences, which have enormous significance for the kind of questions that Fernando was raising. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Now let's introduce Professor Honglei Li for his speech.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Honglei Li from Sun Yat-sen University, Zhongshan 大学. in China. Today, my topic is Confucianism and citizenship education, 弟子规 as an example. 弟子 means students, 规 rule. As me, I speak in Chinese. You can listen and watch my English paper. Now, let's begin. First, what is citizenship education? 什么是公民教育？严格的说，在中国没有全面的引进公民教育的理念，所以会议主持人让我来讲讲中国现在做的事情，只能说是类公民教育。根据我的了解，公民教育指一个国家或者社会根据有关的法律和要求，培养他所属成员具有忠诚的履行公民权利和义务的品格与能力等的教育。它的目的在于培养公民的爱国心、公德心以及权利和义务的意思。简单的说，就是要培养一个既懂得保护自己权利，又能够为国家贡献义务的公民。This is first. Second, variation of citizenship education among nations. 其实不同的国家对公民教育有不同的做法，因为一个国家的历史、文化和现行的政治、经济、文化体制的差异的影响，各个国家公民教育的目标、内容以及教育模式是不相同的。比如美国的公民教育更加强调培养积极参与的、有影响力的公民。但是亚洲国家，特别是东亚国家，受儒家文化圈的国家，比如说日本、韩国、新加坡，他们的公民教育以道德教育为中心，重点强调道德对于个人、家庭、社会、国家记忆、民族兴亡的重要。新加坡比较典型，它有共同价值白皮书作为公民教育的纲领，完全体现了我刚才讲的儒家的这种精神。Now, third, Chinese ideological and political education. 我刚才讲了，严格的说，当代中国没有全面的、主动的开展公民教育。那么有没有呢？实际上，中华人民共和国成立以来的这几十年，我们在学校里面的一门课，在座大多数都是在中国读书过来的，你们都上过这门课，叫思想政治课。这课的名称有多次改变，现在定名叫做思想政治课、思想政治学。 这门课实际上起着某种公民教育的作用，所以我说它是类公民教育。但是你们都是过来人，我也在大学里面，我也看到，我们从小也受这教育，总感觉到这种教育不如人意，本末颠倒。这个我脱稿讲一讲，你们都过来人。小时候教我们做什么？小学生教我们做共产主义接班人。小孩7、8岁不懂共产什么要得教人。后来到了中学，发现他们毕业工作了，降低一个档次，叫什么呢？社会主义建设者，从共产主义调到社会主义了。再到大学，发现18岁的人了，连一个起码的礼貌都不懂。大学家就重新来教，你好，对不起，请坐，这类的礼仪教育，完全本末颠倒。所以教育的效果怎么样呢？我不知道你们有没有想想你们大学生活。我所在的中山大学学生会专门制作个牌挂在黑板旁边，上面写着什么呢？请为老师擦黑板。大概你们都看过这样的牌吧？我们中大有位学生很调皮，请为老师擦黑板，把那个“为”字去掉了，请老师擦黑板。所以这种教育就发现，实在是你们都考过来了，大概会考得很高分，但是学了不懂得怎么跟自己最亲近的人，老师、父母、兄弟姐妹、同学打交道。我回到这来，原因在哪里？我归纳为3点：重理想，轻现实。共产主义伟大理想，轻现在面对的中国的现实。重知识而轻德化。受教育应试教育的影响，我们把这门课也当成考试课，甚至考大学还要政治课要考的，所以你们当成考试了，我不当成一种素质的培养。重思想而轻行为，只告诉他应该怎么样，但是没告诉他究竟应该怎么做，具体行为怎么做没有。所以这种空谈理想、本末倒置的教育，怎么可能收到预期的效果呢？我注意到等一下的讲课的因为张校长、张书记，不懂来不来啊？他就是这方面专家。等一下你们可以问他，你主持国家的思想政治教育，究竟想达到什么效果？效果达到了吗？不懂张书记在不在下面？Now fourth, Confucius view of education， 孔夫子的教育观。简单的说，孔夫子的教育观就是2个字：成人。这个“成”是动词，让你成为一个人。那你们说我不是人吗？像呢，你们都知道18岁才是正式拥有公民权的人，在这之前，那就是教你学会公民。而实际上从哲学角度来看，人生下来他是人，不过他是个自然的人，跟动物没有多大区别，出来也是光溜溜的，没有穿衣服的。当父母一给他穿上衣服了以后，这个衣服就再也脱不掉了。所以人类学家说，人是什么？人是穿衣服的动物。你看过哪个动物穿衣服？当然，那个宠物那是人给他穿的。所以衣服一穿上以后就脱不掉了，那就是进入个社会。但是 那是外在的，思想上慢慢让你进入。成人教育 ，a natural person into social person， 从自然人到社会人。孔子先教育就是讲这个，怎么样达到？这就要教育他和谐的处理好自己和自己，自己和他人，自己和社会的关系。而以往的思想教育只教给孩子们空洞的理论，用于考试，却没有教会他们如何与他人和社会相处的规范，以用于实行。《弟子规》被誉为天下人生第一部，天下第一规，教你怎么样跟你最亲近的人开始，父母、老师、同学，然后推广到社会上去，跟他们打交道，该怎么做，言行举止。所以，《弟子规》可以说是古代的道德教育的读本，也可以作为现代公民教育的辅助教材。这就是近几年来中国大陆《弟子规》广泛兴起，无论是官方、民间都在用《弟子规》来给中小学生进行教育的运用。Fifth, what is 弟子规 about？ 弟子规讲什么？弟子规哪里来的？弟子规实际上是儒家孔子的思想，它的基本思想来自孔子《论语》中一段话：弟子入则孝，出则悌，泛爱众，而亲仁，行有余力，则以学为。孔子心目中的好学生是什么呢？在家里面先孝敬你的父母，跟你兄弟姐妹搞好关系，然后去接近那些有仁德的人，对天下人要有爱心，泛爱众，然后把这做了，有时间再来学文化知识。这是孔子的思想，弟子规根据这思想来编的。好，下面我跟大家介绍一下我这10几年来在《弟子规》的推广方面做的几项工作。6. Teaching college students 弟子规。我从2000年到2011年担任中大哲学系主任，做了11年。我给中大哲学系的学生有一个他们认为是比较奇怪的规定：新生进来罚的第一本书是《弟子规》。上的第一门课是系主任我来讲的，题目是什么？学会感恩，从感谢父母开始。上完了以后，孩子们要把你今天听课的体会写信告诉你的父母，然后父母回信，效果相当好，就我做的第一项。7. Introducing 弟子规 to primary and secondary school students 中小学生。2010年，我在我的家乡海南省琼海市恢复了一个明清时期的书院，它原名叫世德堂，把它作为海南省青少年国学教育基地，正在开展。很遗憾，我没有来不及有更多的数据来告诉大家，但是现在来看，从质的角度来看，定性的角度来看，效果很好。下面有一个海南新民谣 ，New Hainan Folk Ballad， 干部不学弟子规，一不留神 背双规，大家知道双规是什么意思了？世人不学《弟子规》，一不留神家破碎。各位，这2句是一个犯人写的，海南省经济局一个厅级干部被关进去以后，经济局组织他学《弟子规》，前面2句是他写的。后来我看了这个，我补上后面2句：学生不学《弟子规》，一不留神形成毁，没形成。全民都学《弟子规》，社会和谐，幸福美。现在经海南省教育厅的推广，现在成为小孩子编起来唱的民谣了。S， 这是企业员工学习《弟子规》。我昨天晚上介绍了，2006年我办了一个华商书院，华商书院都是民营企业家的董事长，然后呢，要他们回去，要求带他的员工一起学《弟子规》，效果也相当好。时间关系，关于讨论的问题，等一下一起来讨论。我的发言结束，谢谢大家。
Thank our speakers very much. We welcome you back on the stage. We will have about 15-minute discussion. We welcome our discussant, Joseph Zhang Youguo, to moderate the discussion. Joseph is a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Graduate School of Education, a research fellow at the Fairbanks Center, and also a researcher at the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College. He worked for UNESCO and International Red Cross from 2002 to 2006, focusing on promoting educational development and exchange in Asian and European countries. His research interests include international higher education, liberal arts education, education equity, education policy and leadership, moral and civic education, ethical philosophy, and counseling. His most recent research focused on comparative studies on global, liberal, and civic education among United States, China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and other Asian countries in producing graduates concerned with critical thinking and civic duties and with developed intelligence in today's global context. Joe, please.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you very much, Fernando, Helen, and Hong Lei for your excellent speech this morning. I'm personally very inspired. So basically, Fernando talked about some of the principles of enlightenment. How does these principles affect our understanding of cultural tolerance and also our understanding about different cultures and pluralism? As you can see from his PowerPoint there, he showed to us that in China, while the social trusts are relatively high level, but trust in other people, other nationality, and other religion are quite low. And also, he mentioned about this really diminished the opportunity for people in China to start respect, and also there's collective action among the people. So for Helen, for her presentation, had mentioned about her project with Bob and Xu Zhao in Shanghai. How does this civic engagement among the 8th people and 11th grade high school students in Shanghai and Nantong, which are also part of that one, their understanding about the civic engagement in China today. Helen also mentioned exams, the conditions and the context of a good citizen, and issues and the government need to improve, and also the 4 relational dilemmas which students encounter in their studies and interviews. And one of the most important key issue here is Helen contrasts American students and Chinese students. How does the culture impact people's moral decision and civic engagement? And Dr. Hong Lei, he first traced back to the tradition of citizenship in Chinese tradition, from Confucian tradition, and compared to the Western tradition like American and some East Asian countries. He also mentioned about in China, people are kind of reverse the end and means of education. So although we have kind of a civic education in China, but more about political education, more about patriotism. So Hong Lin agrees that there should be some change in contemporary society. Therefore, he kind of implemented 弟子规 华商 kind of college for implement its traditional citizenship education in related with contemporary society. How do we cultivate a whole person, holistic person, which are socially, spiritually, culturally integrated? So personally, I felt also Fernando had mentioned about spiritual religious tradition, which is part of civic education, is very powerful. Because as we say, in the Western countries, religion or spirituality has been a foundation of civic education. In the Western tradition, civic education more about social justice, social engagement, and tolerance, and cultural understanding, mutual respect, and human dignity, and human life. But in Chinese tradition, our civic education more about love the country, love the party. So this is a big challenge for us today. And how do we compare this global aspect to work out universal civic education which can apply to China, also to the Western countries? So it's my fallen to ask you one or two questions, Fernando, Helen, or Hong Lin. As you know from your research and study, China is not a fully democratic society, and its Communist Party controls almost everything, decide everything. So how do you think, how do we implement civic education in China today? What's the most challenging issue you feel?
Shall I start?
Yeah.
Well, I would say that perhaps I can contextualize it in terms of my own impressions of China and as I mentioned in my talk, the contrast that I expected and what I actually found. I was expecting, having a Western perspective, the Western stereotypes, that the young people we would encounter would be very conformist, quite frightened of authority, worried about breaking the rules, and really lacking what we'd regard as the sort of normal agency, efficacy, sense of wanting to criticize that we tend to assume is common in the West. In fact, both in our experiences of the interviewing and my more informal interactions with undergraduates and graduate students in various Chinese universities where I spoke, I found a very healthy sense of a critical perspective on the system, not a great deal of explicit fear, though there obviously was an undercurrent of, you can go only so far before things start to be a bit difficult, but the general sense of open discussion and a willingness and wish to have these open discussions and a willingness to actually make quite critical statements up to a point amongst the people I met. So I think the stereotype of a highly conformist society, which we in the West tend to hold, is, I think, well, either it wasn't ever there, or certainly it's rapidly changing. I think, however, the concern that you expressed, Joseph, and also the young people we interviewed expressed, that the rise of materialist values is worrying because, in a sense, my impression is, apart from our interviews and from my other reading, is that this materialism is not something that has been part of the dominant part of Chinese culture, in China at least, historically. There isn't a kind of history of individual materialism in the way that there has been in the West, linked perhaps to the Enlightenment traditions. And I think this worries young people quite a lot, while at the same time is they're happy buying everything in sight if they can afford it. Nevertheless, there is this undercurrent of thing of spiritual, almost spiritual degradation that comes with individualistic materialism. So that's a sort of rather impressionistic answer.
I will try to answer the question, but not directly. Let me first say that one of the most important tensions in historical analysis is the tension between the power of structures relative to the power of agency of individuals to alter structures. And I am convinced that agencies trumps structures most of the time. That's what brings me. That's why I'm interested in both civic education and in entrepreneurship education, which to my mind are actually quite related. The second thing I'd like to say is that culture anywhere is a fluid process. It's always in the process of becoming. Culture is not fixed. It's not fixed within a society at a given point in time. It is even less fixed over time. To give you an idea, in this country, only 100 years ago, it was very difficult. It was impossible for women to access an institution like Harvard, and it was very difficult for women to access higher education. That has changed quite a bit. We still have some work to do, as I showed, but those cultural norms change. And the third thing I'd like to share is that I believe that the civic education project is particularly when it responds to an enlightenment conception, always a work in progress. Who we define as having the right to participate and what does it mean to participate is always in the process of becoming. So having said that, I think that in China there is a lot of opportunity, I believe, and action for individual innovators. I do not expect the greatest changes in civic education to be the result of some grand master plan, but rather the work of ordinary people who have an interest in producing progress and prosperity in China, and who will go on to do things as teachers, as administrators of public, of private institutions, maybe not even as educators. I believe, to go back to the Enlightenment, particularly to the Scottish Enlightenment, there is a very interesting and unexplored association between what is civic education and what is the development of a free market. The work of nations, the notion that you can produce economic prosperity not as a result of some grand master plan by a state, but as a result of unleashing the constraints that would allow individual economic agents to pursue self-interest, and that the collective product of selfishness would translate in social good. I think those two things are connected, and I think in many ways, if you think about the American experiment, it's very much about connecting those two ideas. Perhaps the best example of how those two ideas are embodied in the actions of the same individuals is look at the work of Benjamin Franklin, the ultimate economic entrepreneur, very important builder of an American narrative of citizen, and certainly the ultimate citizen, both citizen in this country and also diplomat and so on. And so it's quite possible that the innovators in China who would do the most to advance civic education are not the people who help governments develop some grand master plan, but the people who are concerned about how to produce economic prosperity in China. And what would it take to develop the dispositions, the habits of mind, and the skills for people to be able to create wealth and progress and economic progress, and to be able to engage with their global counterparts to continue to integrate China into the global economy, because they will discover, I think sooner rather than later, that some of the values that I showed here, that a value that women are intrinsically less qualified for leadership than men, is absolutely incompatible with the notion of engaging in a global economy, and would cause those who hold such values to be rejected and ostracized and marginalized from opportunities for progress. Now, the question then is, how does one support those innovators to speed up, to accelerate their potential beneficial contributions to a society? And I think that innovators would benefit the most when there is an ecosystem, when they're not alone, when they know they are in community, when they find the opportunity to come together with others who share aspirations, to challenge one another, and to collaborate. This is why Cambridge is such a wonderful place, because it is an ecosystem for innovators. It's an ecosystem that attracts them. In some places, created deliberately for that. The Cambridge Innovation Lab, for example, 4 floors in a building across from MIT, which are the places that raise the most capital per square foot in the world. And why is it there? Because it's located in this city. I would think that very soon, if it isn't happening already, there will be individuals in China interested in creating these ecosystems for entrepreneurial and social innovation, and that's where I think most of the interesting action is going to be in the future.
Thank you, Brandon.
共产党在变化，我的意思，共产党在变化。共产党一直以为自己是个革命党， 2004年，中国共产党通过一个决议，关于加强党的执政能力的决议。第一是明确共产党在当代中国的定位是什么？执政党。直接翻译我的话。
Okay. Communist Party have come to realize that it is a ruling party, an administrative party, rather than a revolution party. So in 2004, it passed a document called Strengthening the Communist Party's Administrative Power to officially recognize its status as the ruling party.
在这种情况下，要执政，就要负起对社会的责任。所以，公民教育跟共产党的执政目标是不矛盾的，完全可以融合起来的。这是我的看法。
In order to administer the society, the party has to have social responsibility, and therefore the civic education goal is in harmony with ruling China.
当然，现在共产党搞的这种教育呢，更多的是从中国文化传统，也就是说，从儒家传统中得出一些结论、智慧来教育公民。共产党不但支持，自己还带头实行。这就是我刚才讲的例子。example， 广东省委去年通过一个决议，新时期广东精神9个字：厚于德，诚于信，勉于行。如果你们读过45经，知道这9个字全部都是孔子的话。一个共产党的省委把孔子的话作为全省的根本精神。这个人是谁呢？广东省委书记汪洋，现在已经上任国务院副总理。
Communist Party is extracting wisdom from the Confucianism classics to use as their principles, and they are leading this effort. Last year, the Cantonese Communist Party Commission established the new Cantonese spirit. It took 9 words from Confucian classics. To briefly translate, that means that they need to value morality, public trust, and practice. The person who raised this concept is Wang Yang, the former secretary of the Communist Party in Canton, and now the vice prime minister.
Yeah, please.
Professor Ramos' presentation first slide really struck me at 2 and 3 as a very surprising. All in China, we know from everybody's visit that trust is a huge issue. Now he's showing that everybody likes trust. And third one, religious, it's also pretty surprising. Anyway, then remind me of a paper by Professor Gary King in the government department. It's called Anchoring the Net, actually addressing this thing about international study. That there's a confusion about question and answers may not be what the surveyor may not understand the question really. So I wonder your comment about if you're taking this into consideration. That's a fancy title of anchoring the nets, but basically talking about this misunderstanding of question survey. And if you could reassess the survey result and what you think is real issue there about trust, about religions, about growth.
Okay. Thank you.
弟子规我们的讲法是老师一味的说这个是好的，然后学生们要学，然后大家就一致的、一齐的来说，这是一种类似于。说的不好听一点是brainwash式的教育，实际上这个东西是非常好。10几年前我爸爸就买了2本仪器，给了我的表妹。但是就是我现在觉得它是有问题的。美国我们的课堂里经常是讨论，人们是有不同的观点，你来我往，这样人们可以有自己的选择，哪个是好的，我选择哪个。可是我们的《弟子规》的教育是这个是好的，你没有选择，你只能选择这一个。然后呢，就是最近要有一个事件，就是说一个校长和一个什么房产科长领着6个孩子出了学校了。那6个孩子为什么就那么听话？当他们领他们出去的时候，到那个 hotel 的时候，为什么不说不？没有，就是为什么就能把他们领走？是因为我们的《弟子规》做得太好了，学生太听话了。
谢谢。
谢谢。
Maybe now Fernando want to address Wei's question.
Any research method obviously has strengths as well as limitations, which is the reason we build the building of theory is an enterprise that needs to draw on multiple studies that draw on multiple methodologies. I am quite aware of the good work of Professor Gary King on the challenges of public opinion polls for the reasons that you mentioned. The anchoring can only be done, as you know, including specific items that measure accurate information. You know, how bright is the day, so that you can cancel the biases of individuals within a country or across places. I do think, however, that one of the virtues of using survey instruments that have been in use over quite a long period of time and which have led to the publication of thousands of papers is that the team in the process of developing those surveys is going to do the best effort that is possible within that methodology. So I would rather use to measure public opinion attitudes the World Values Survey than an ad hoc survey developed specifically at one point in time to measure issues at one point in time in China, which would have even more of the problems that you're talking about. I cannot answer your question as to whether the paradox that I discovered is a function of the fact that people understood better the question of toleration towards difference in nationality, gender, or religious affiliation than they did understand the question of do you trust others, or the other way around. It's something that, with the evidence that I examined, I can't answer.
Thank you. Maybe Helen want to answer in a bit? No, Helen want to answer in a few minutes. Yeah?
Comment to your slides and then the picture that you showed.
Yes.
Those characters printed is not been taught in China, so it's surprising. I don't know anybody wrote this up. That kid's holding that.
Yes.
So then this picture is not what we learned in China. So I'm guessing in the media somebody wrote that for me. They just put in that.
You mean, where do I get the picture from?
No, that's again a cultural thing. The character that printed on this one, it's not what we learned in China. It's so-called traditional Chinese way.
Yes, it's traditional. I cannot comment on the linguistics, of course, but I was informed that it wasn't modern Chinese.
Yeah.
Why did the young man choose to use traditional Chinese characters? It's a very interesting question.
I'm part of the project is from Guangdong, so that's the guy who wrote in Cantonese, well, not kind of Cantonese style, you know, traditional character. So that's.
It's quite unusual. I just thought, wow, this is now we expect a 70-year-old grow up from China with those words there. So.
I think he was a fairly unusual young man, but very useful for our studies. If I could respond, I understand Riran very kindly, roughly translated what you said. A couple of points I'd like to raise, because you're talking really about, I think, methods of education, and I think there are two dimensions to this. One is, does a particular method of education convey a particular way of thinking? And secondly, is a particular method of education effective? And I think your concern about top-down teaching, where the teacher is the authority and the child basically writes it all down, doesn't question it, that on the one hand, that will reflect a particular institutional norm about order and authority. So the child doesn't just learn what the teacher is teaching, the child learns that authority matters and you don't question it. So it's a meta level of learning, which indeed is probably inconsistent with some of the things that we might desire in civic education for all kinds of reasons, including ideological. But secondly, of course, we increasingly, as you know, we think that education that is top-down is less effective in all possible criteria in terms of getting young people to be able to think, understand, use the material that they have learned in effective and innovative ways. In all senses of the word innovative, not only politically innovative. So really, it's a question of making education effective by having open discussion, by having the opportunity for the child to have a role initiating what they are learning, not merely being a sort of vessel to receive the wisdom of the teacher. So there are two dimensions here. One is effective pedagogy, and the other is the cultural and institutional messages of a particular kind of culture, a particular kind of pedagogy that is conveyed to the child.
Thank you, Helen. Maybe Hong want to address.
谢谢你的问题。你刚才讲的例子，恰恰是《弟子规》没学好。为什么呢？《弟子规》有一句话：“亲有过，见始更。”父亲母亲有过错，当孩子的要劝他，一直到他改正为止。所以呢，很多人没有全文读《弟子规》， 主观的认为《弟子规》就教孩子听母亲的话、父母亲的话，错。《弟子规》天下没有不是的父母，这是当父母的各取所需。儒家不这样主张，《弟子规》也不这样主张。当然，我也注意到很多父母拿来教孩子《弟子规》，就是要孩子听话。所以我在教育中很注意这条亲子教育，不是说我发一本书你回去教孩子，你先来，我先教你，我先教企业董事长，你教会了带头做，回去教你员工。我先教父母带头做，回去教孩子。父母是孩子最好榜样，如果你做不到，你就不要要求孩子做。所以董事长一样，你做不到就不要求员工做。为什么？我跟他开玩笑说，我也当过，在中国当了8年工人，中国的工人天下最聪明的工人。所以呢，你当老板的，讲老实话，说的不好听，你放什么屁，人家都知道。所以呢，你根本你骗不了工人，所以你要带头做。所以我很强调这条。所以呢，我相信按照我这样做，就会消除这些弊病。好，谢谢你的问题。
谢谢。
谢谢黄委。
Thank you all very much.